Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the All Saints Online podcast. In these first few episodes, we are going to introduce you to a few of the faces and voices that you will see in the All Saints Online content. We hope that you enjoyed this series of episodes, as well as all of our episodes covering a broad range of topics from faith and spirituality to mental health to addiction to inclusion and to everything in between. We are so excited that you decided to tune in today. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, help us out, rate us 5 stars. If not 5 stars, then then why you gotta be so rude, okay? No, seriously, we cannot be more thankful for you listening to the All Saints Online podcast. We are so excited to get started. So as we dive in today, I want you to imagine a place where the doors are wide open, where the seats are filled with an array of faces, all different, yet united in seeking understanding, purpose, and a sense of belonging. This isn't just a dream, it's a reality that is being crafted by the hands and the heart of the pastor we have with us today. Pastor Chris Jorgensen, who is with us today, is not only well-versed in Scripture, but also in the art of listening, truly listening to the stories that each person carries through these doors. Her mission goes beyond the Sunday sermon. It's about creating a community where everyone, regardless of background, identity, or belief, is valued and can belong. One of the things that we love to say in our faith community is all means all. And Pastor Chris Jorgensen embodies that in everything that she does. So Pastor Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's awesome to be here. Thank you.
And if you could just start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, as Chris said, I'm a pastor. I am blessed and frankly, just really lucky to call myself the lead pastor of All Saints Online and St. Andrew's United Methodist Church here in Omaha. We are the second largest United Methodist Church in the state of Nebraska. And it's just a blessing to be here and be a pastor. Besides being a pastor, I'm a mom. I have an 18-year-old daughter who I'm super proud of and who just has filled my life with so much meaning. I have a husband, a spouse who is a teacher, and I am just grateful for all of those pieces of my life and the way they come together. So, yeah, that's who I am.
And along that, I've already said it like 4 times that you're a pastor. And so I really want to know was there a specific moment where you just knew in that moment that God was kind of guiding you to becoming a pastor? Was it a specific event? Was it more gradual? But just how did that come about?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is yes. Yes, and there's been a long process and a long journey, but there have absolutely been moments that have encouraged me to go ahead and continue to move forward on that journey and sort of boldly follow where God is calling me. Interestingly, my journey into ministry, my call, starts with a conversion experience. So I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I left that tradition when I was in college. I got interested in studying world religions and did that, but kind of looked at religion from an objective standpoint, not necessarily a real practicing standpoint. I was a Unitarian for a while. We stopped going to that church. Eventually, Matt and I and Ruby started going to First United Methodist Church here in Omaha. And even though I would sit in the seats every week at First United Methodist Church, I was there with a lot of skepticism. I would kind of listen to the sermons and be like, well, when is Pastor Jane going to say the thing where I'm like, I'm out. Like, I can't get behind that. But that never happened. And in fact, it gave me an opportunity to sort of embrace my faith as an adult, sort of pick up an adult version of my faith, a faith that could ask questions, a faith that could withstand my questions. And so it was during some music at First United Methodist Church one day where I kind of had the actual thought in my head, like, what would happen if I surrendered myself to this thing that I'm experiencing when I am in worship here? And I had a real, like what I said, I would describe as a conversion experience, an experience of God's grace that helped me to see myself, I think, as God sees me, as God's beloved child, just as I am, created just as I am with the gifts that I have. Also, I felt myself to be sort of forgiven for all my imperfection. I have a perfectionist streak, and so spend a lot of time in my life trying not to make mistakes so that I would feel okay with the way I was walking in the world. And I think that had made me start to live life in a really small way, to not take risks and not be bold. But after this conversion experience, I realized like I had one job, and my job was to recognize myself as God's beloved child and then share that love with the world. And as I started to walk in the world in that different way, I saw my life transformed. I felt just confident to take risks and be more of who God created me to be. And it was amazing. And I started to ask the question, well, how do I let other people know about this? Like, how can I share this experience with other people? And I always say those are the kinds of questions when you ask them, you start thinking, oh crap, I think maybe I'm supposed to be a pastor. So that happened. And then, so I started thinking about it and thinking, well, maybe this is something I'm being called to. And then one day I was walking in Memorial Park, and I was thinking about some, stuff related to home, some practical business of home. And I heard the words. I don't think they were actually audible, but it was sort of like this message in my mind. The words, "You are meant for bigger things." And I was just like, what? and I stopped. I can remember stopping and looking around, and I'm like, okay, I see other people here, but they're like across the park. And I know that sounds sort of woo-woo, but I do think that every once in a while, when we're maybe stuck in a place where we're being called in a direction, but we just need that little push to sort of really embrace that thing we're being called to, that we do experience the presence of God, or sort of a sense of God that helps move us forward. And that was one of those times. So that happened, and then I'm like, oh, well, I guess I better take this seriously now. Like, this is serious. I have since reinterpreted those words, thinking about you as being more a plural than a singular word. That you are meant for bigger things is actually about what we do together as community. But at the time, I didn't think of it that way. I was like, Chris Jorgensen, you need to be a pastor. So I started talking to my pastor, Jane Florence, and Pastor Deborah McKnight, who was the associate pastor at First Church too. And they were just like, well, thank you for coming to us. We see gifts in you. Please, I'm glad to hear you want to do this. And so then it just became a process of thinking about the gifts and graces that are required for people going into ministry. And eventually I just thought, I looked at what it would take to be a local church pastor, including the gifts for public speaking and creative writing, and even gifts of administration that I really have. And I really felt like I found what I was created to be. And so it's still to this day sort of a shock to me that I'm a pastor. Like, it does. I always say anyone who would stand up and think they were going to say something about God in a room full of people is just an absolutely ludicrous thing to think you might do. And yet I do think it's what I'm called to do. And so I just try to do the best I can when I'm given the opportunity to do that.
So thinking back on that spiritual journey that you're talking about, how has that journey informed the way that you lead and support your congregation now?
Yeah, it has influenced me a ton. And I try to remember that not everyone's experience is the same as mine. And I try to be really aware of, there are people in the congregation who have been, say, part of a United Methodist church or a very particular church tradition since they were babies, and that's always been what they've done, and it's just, sort of part of who they are. But like, my conversion experience is a huge piece for me. And I don't think a conversion experience necessarily has to look like I wasn't in the church and now I'm part of the church. Even John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, historians say they can kind of chart 3 conversion experiences that he had where his faith was deepened and then lived out more fully in his life because of these moments that he experienced. So I think when I get up and preach, I think about, the people who are sitting in the pews, they've heard, a lot of them, most of them have heard this before. How can I talk about the transforming love of God in a way that's going to connect with them, that will help them to see it in a new way, and maybe make that move and that growth in faith that will become a transformative moment in their life. And so again, every time I think of it and I say it out loud, I think how absurdly ambitious, the level of ambition it takes to say, like, I think because I experienced a transformative moment of God's presence that changed my life, that might happen in this worship service that I have something to do with. I'm also real humble to know it happened during music for me. So maybe my job as the preacher is just don't mess this up, right? Mm-hmm. Don't ruin this. Don't ruin this for people, because the transformation is happening whether I want it to or not, because it's the work of God. But how can I get out of the way? But maybe also how can I be part of a catalyst to transform individual lives and transform communities? And I think it has to do with encouraging people to be courageous, and because they can fail, and that will not change that they are beloved of God, and it will not change their value and their worth. And I think when you can live from that place, it's been my experience that I'm just able to do so much more. And I think if I can invite people into that experience with me, just imagine what we can let God do through us when we're all being courageous together. So yeah, everything I do is sort of grounded in that.
That's great. I was like, I'm fired up. I'm like, let's go do something.
Let's go do it.
We got this. But you brought up John Wesley, and because we are United Methodists and we talk a lot about John Wesley, it just fun question that I always like to ask people is, if you could have a cup of coffee with any figure from like religious history, who would it be and why would you want to have coffee with them?
Right. Well, I feel like I sort of have to apologize to John Wesley because the answer is not John Wesley. Although I would love to talk to him. I really relate to John Wesley and his sort of personality of, he's this super orderly guy. There's a reason we're called Methodist. It's because John Wesley ordered the stuff that he expected his followers to do, right? And I have that. But also it's almost like he was always at war with this tendency of like, but it actually is about this transformative experience of God's love. That's what really matters. Anyway, so I would want to talk to John about that. But the person that I think I really would want to sit down and have a cup of coffee with is Julian of Norwich. She was a medieval anchoress, and an anchoress means that she had this little room on the side of a church that she was walled into. So like, I'm interested in talking to someone who's going to make that decision with their life. Like, what kind of life decision is this, Julian? You're going to live in a walled-in room on the side of a church. She had a cat, which I'm for, so I'd want to talk to her about that. But mostly, I'd like to talk to her. She was a mystic, and so she has this book of what are called her showings. They're the ways that she had these mystical experiences of Jesus showing up to her and like sharing this. It's Revelations of Divine Love is kind of the subtitle of her showings. And the reason I love Julian is because I'm so interested in the sort of radical theology that shows up in these Revelations of Divine Love, and its tension with this very traditional thing she was a part of, being a Catholic in this, anchorage on the side of this church. And one of my favorite things about Julian's writings, there's a whole bunch of stuff I love in there, but she has this one section where she's talking about what I would describe as the possibility of universal salvation. And basically it was revealed to her that somehow everyone would be saved. And she has this awareness of the fact that the church itself does not say this. And she just holds this very interesting tension of like, she kind of says something like, well, even though Mother Church tells us that this is not so, yet this is what Christ revealed to me. And then she uses this language of God saying, here's how this is going to work out. God says, what is impossible to you is not impossible to me. And I just would love to sit down with Julian and ask her more about like, what is it like to live in this space of feeling like God has revealed to you that the limitations of what humans think they know about God, that's the things seem impossible to us that then are not impossible to God. So that's what I want to talk to Julian about. I've got questions.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued about the walling yourself in. I mean, having 5 kids, there are times when I have the feeling like I would like to do that, but as like a spiritual practice. But I actually recently just read some of Julian.
Oh,
I say right. I was like,
yeah.
I just recently read some of her and some of kind of older mystics and things like that. And I was like, I don't understand why this is like, why people are scared of this when there's so much richness and depth and so much God throughout that. Like her visions, some of them were just incredible and right to the heart of what we believe and teach and why we do believe and teach it.
Julian's interesting too, because if one lived in Anchorage, apparently you would have like a little window where people would come and talk to you. And so I don't know if we actually know that she did, or we just assume that she did have people who would come and talk to her and sort of like, so she would be able to be like a spiritual leader for her community, but also her life was this very interesting quasi monastic thing where she lived by herself. With her cat. If you see images of Julian of Norwich, she always has a cat with her. So you can't hate that, right?
Don't get me started on cats, okay? I'm like, I think this is a great transition to talking about your ministry again. And being a pastor who is a woman, that is historically a very male-dominated role. So what unique perspectives do you think that you bring to your ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, so I was not used to seeing women in leadership, as in a sort of priestly role or a preacher role or whatever. There is a difference, I think, between priests and Protestant preachers that, maybe we could explore that in another conversation. But I do think so. What uniqueness? I mean, I think it's important to have people of all genders be pastors so that the fullness of who God is represented by the people in leadership, right? So uniqueness, yes, but actually not uniqueness, right? Right? There are 51% of the population are women, and so less maybe uniqueness than similarity is the important piece. I do think it's interesting to think about when women historically have been understood or expected to be nurturers and caregivers. Like, I think it makes a lot of sense for pastors to embody that as, part of who they are. And I think, pastoring, it has a real both and to it. Like there's a sense of you need to be a person in authority who can speak with some authority about what God is saying and what kind of lives God is calling us to, and also a person of care, right? And a person of presence. And so I do think, again, I wouldn't talk about it as naturally women are a certain way, but certainly we have been socialized to be a certain way. And so maybe, I've had practice all my life being expected to be a nurturer. So when even though I have a pretty strong personality, like I've had enough experience when I am at the bedside with someone that also feels natural to me to be able to be a caring presence as well. So I also do talk about, what Chris Jorgensen was like before and after she got Jesus. And I do feel like for me, the compassionate and nurturing presence is a gift of the Holy Spirit. I certainly have some of that. Again, I was raised a woman. I was socialized to be nurturing and compassionate. But I think, it really was after my conversion that I found the value in that I was like, that's actually compassion and mercy and gentleness is not just something that women are told they have to be, but are in fact highly valued qualities of our Lord, right? of what we are taught to be as Christians. And so I think interestingly, so how does that flip the script on patriarchal culture that says strength and domination and humbleness and gentleness and meekness are things that not just women are called to be, but that perhaps we're all called to be following in the footsteps of Jesus. And so I think having really experienced that as a woman, seeing how maybe it has not been valued in our culture, and then maybe bringing it into the pulpit and insisting that this isn't a devalued quality just for women, but in fact the ideal to which we're all being called. I think I can do that differently than men can probably.
I would agree. I mean, I'm early into being able to work with and work for you and being a part of the staff that we have here. I would just say that this is my first experience working on a staff whose lead pastor is a woman. And I only say that because in my time here, I have noticed that this is the least amount of conflict and least amount of like kind of competitive spirit, kind of like all these different things that I think don't benefit the church in any way, shape, or form. And this is the least amount. And I'm not saying that those are correlated, but I'm just saying that there's one thing different in this situation than any other situation I have ever been in. And so I'm just like, correlation isn't necessarily causation, but it certainly does sometimes feel that way. I know our listeners don't get this experience, but I mean, I experience it every day. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. And it's wonderful.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Well, and I will confess, I don't really know what I'm doing. I mean, part of, because I think in some ways to be a woman in leadership in the church, in the lead pastor role in a church is trailblazing, right? I don't know. I know of one woman who's a large church pastor. I mean, I know a few, right? But I haven't been a part of those staffs, and so in many ways, I feel like we're all kind of learning together. Like, what does it mean? Also, what does it mean to work together in a different way? Like you said, when it's not about competition and it's not about who's climbing into what role, which is just what our culture teaches us. How do we flip the script on that and find a way to collaborate together for the good of the whole community? And that's, again, it shouldn't be women's work doing that, but sometimes it has been. Caring about the community has been the role of women. It's like, well, we're supposed to care about the community as Christians. Maybe women have something to teach us here,
Well, and I, in some ways, don't even necessarily like talking that much about it just because it always bothers me to be like, so as a woman, no, God has put you in a position and you followed that guiding and you're doing it. Like, why do you do it? Because you were told to, like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, but I think there is a value. I mean, I hear that and I appreciate, I appreciate the sentiment of like, you don't say like, oh, I'm going to the doctor. Oh, I'm going to the lady doctor. Like, I get it, right? Like, you're like, oh, I've got the lady pastor. I appreciate that thought. And I think embodiment is important. And I think about, when I stand up to preach and I think of young women who are in the congregation who see, oh my gosh, there's a woman up there preaching, I can do that. And because gender is part of who they are, that matters to them, So I don't mind the question. I think it's a really good question. And again, also because I'm not a complementarian. I don't think God made every woman this way and every man this way. But I do think, again, because of how we're socialized, that women do tend to have more nurturing qualities, again, because like it's okay for women to feel things, right? I mean, it's also okay, just for the record, it is also fine for men to feel things. But maybe women have been taught that more along the way. And, maybe one day it's not going to matter whether there's a person of whatever gender on the platform. But until it's normalized for women to be on the platform, it's important to have a woman represented there, because otherwise you go back to the traditional, the standard, the patriarchal thing that says, okay, well, a man, that's normal. A woman, it's not normal. So I will stand up there for the next 2,000 years until people forget that there was a time when women could be pastors, and then we can stop talking about it.
Again, I appreciate that, and I love that insight, because as a man in ministry, I feel like in many ways I've had a much easier go in ministry because that's not been something I've ever had to argue or fight for or anything like that.
Right.
That'll probably be a future conversation where we just focus on that at some point and just talk about that for an entire episode.
Yeah, we definitely could. Yeah.
I would love to get more into that. But that also leads me to, how does All Saints Online and how does St. Andrews address topics that might be considered taboo or controversial?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just preached a sermon and it was about sex, money, and religion. So I'm not afraid to preach about things that are controversial. And the reason I do it, the reason I step into the pulpit and talk about things that might even make me uncomfortable is because I so am at war with shame. Like I'm at war. I'm having a war with shame. And I think, I think maybe this even connects to my conversion experience, right? This idea that when I was converted to understand myself as beloved of God, it shined light on everything that I thought I needed to be ashamed of, or all the things we couldn't talk about, all the taboo stuff that we needed to feel bad if someone brought this up in our presence or we talked about it. So I do think I really am very compelled to speak into the world about topics that people are told you can't talk about this in order to sort of root out that shame. I also just really believe in telling the truth about what's actually going on in the world. And so sometimes that means having an uncomfortable conversation. I don't know. My faith has made me pretty fearless, not entirely, but pretty fearless. I mean, when you believe that no matter what I say and no matter how mad these people get at me when I get out of this pulpit, I am still a beloved child of God. Like that gives me a lot of courage. It's not everything. It's not every day. It's not 100% of the time, but it has a lot to do with that. And yeah, I think the reason I talk about things openly, if I talk about families, I want to make sure I'm talking about all kinds of different families, about single moms and people who are divorced and gay folks and people who have non-traditional family arrangements, whatever. It's because I feel like if I say those things out loud, I can take away some of that shame that people might be carrying because they've gotten a message from somebody that, oh, you're not okay. So I try to be bold about talking about things that might sometimes be hidden and then therefore create shame and self-dislike among people. I think, again, we are all created as beloved children of God. We trust in God, our creator, to make us good. So I want to help people see themselves and the created world as good. And then first thing you have to do is talk about it.
Hearing that from my experience growing up in faith communities, every faith community I've been a part of up until now has truly been based in fear and shame. It's not been about experience the joy and richness in a life and community that is connected through God and through the Holy Spirit. It's always been about no, you want to not mess up and not feel shame. The goal was to avoid what you feared and to avoid shame instead of experiencing that richness and joy that is a life following after God and following after community that is just built on people being able to be comfortable and belonging and everybody being at their own place on this journey on the giant spinning rock and everyone just getting that place to belong without qualifiers. Because I think that's just it. So many times people get these qualifiers, sometimes even unspoken. It's just I think you said it, somewhere along the line, they get told this or we get told that. And I know for me and my spiritual journey for sure has been marked with that moment of spending years and years and years being told this is truth, just this is truth, this is truth. And then I went out and actually tried to validate that truth and found out that it wasn't true, and so it's just been that constant questioning and asking and guiding, and then realizing somewhere along the way that this life that I'm called to and following and pursuing Jesus Christ is one of peace and joy. So why do I always sit here and feel shame and feel scared or wonder if I should feel shame? I don't feel bad about that, but should I?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because I think that's one of the reasons Julian of Norwich and her journey appeals so much to me is because I feel like she was sort of wrestling with the same thing, right? I think that the ultimate question is, do we believe when we say God is love? And do we believe that what we are called to is love or not? Or is it something else, right? And I think for Julian, with her visions, God revealed to her what this love that conquers all things looks like. It's love that conquers all things. It's not power. It's not violence. It's not shame. It's not fear. It's not control. It's love that conquers all things. And so she has this vision, and then she goes back and she's an anchorist. So she's very traditional. The woman has walled herself in next to a church in this traditional thing she's doing. And yet she holds this tension of, and I know, and Julia knows that God is about love and that love conquers everything and makes things that we think are impossible possible. And she just holds on to that until the very freaking end. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to wall myself on the side of a church. I'm not. But I do sort of feel a little bit like in the role of a pastor in the United Methodist Church, which is, has been very open. I think maybe more open than the traditions that you've been a part of, Chris. But also, it's still in conversation with that tradition, right? It still has to say no to the shame and the fear and say yes unequivocally to grace and love and live in the nervousness of, but if we actually tell everyone they're okay, what's going to happen? And I think it's Yeah, I think it's just the tension we're sort of called to live in. And again, it's been my experience that when I see people liberated by love, like myself, that good things happen. And I would not go back to a life without faith. I certainly wouldn't go back to a life of faith that told me I had to stay in a box and not be a leader and not tell people what I really thought about things. So, because I believe in the grace of God, I can do it, right?
Yeah. There's another another Catholic who I think has so much knowledge that he imparted to the world, was so incredibly important, even though a lot of people have never heard of him. His name's Henry Nouwen, and he was a Catholic priest. His kind of whole thing, and all of these books and all of these things that he wrote were all centered around when you find the tension and you live in the tension, that's where you truly start to get somewhere in your spiritual formation. That's where you finally start to get somewhere, and truly being able to see and recognize the grace and mercy and joy and love. One of his examples was finding the tension between loneliness and solitude. Is one of my favorites. And what he would kind of the imagery that he used is that you have to walk through a valley of loneliness to get to the garden of solitude. But it ends up, when we live in that tension, we get through all of that, what I would say the negativity. We can pass through all of that shame, all of those things that were put upon us that we didn't kind of, I didn't agree to be conditioned in that way or to be whatever, but the shame, the fear, all of that stuff. And if we sit in that tension and we find peace almost in that tension, that's when true joy and love can be revealed to us. And so I just really appreciated that with him in his writings, because every writing basically came back to that of live in the tension. That is where growth and that is where true joy, grace, and peace come from.
Right. Yeah.
Sitting in the tension.
Yeah, and another Catholic, so we're having the Catholic time here, Catholic hour. Father Richard Rohr is another Catholic who has been, important to me recently, and I think this is similar to that, living in the tension. He also talks about liminal spaces, which I think might be sort of the living in the tension sort of writ large, like your whole your whole time period you're in becomes living in the tension. But this space of not necessarily knowing something's happening to you in your soul, knowing that you're being changed, and being able to sit in that time of questioning, that time of being unsure, that time of not knowing what the future looks like, and not seeking to rush out of it, which is really a very difficult thing for me because I am always rushing forward to sort of I'm a sort of ultimate Band-Aid ripper offer. So I'm like, if a Band-Aid needs to be ripped off, I'll take it. But I do think what you're saying is right, that sometimes being able to sit in the tension and not resolve something is, and maybe a more honest way to live, right? In the complexity of the world. So much of religious tradition, I think, wants to whittle things down to being simpler than they really are. And I think that does a lot of damage to the people who fall outside what the simple answers are supposed to be, right? And I think, again, if God created all of us, which I believe God did, the world is very complex. Our lives are very complex. God does not want something different than that. That is exactly what God wants and created. And how do we find the joy and the peace and the mercy and the love and the justice in that complexity, not by denying the complexity. So
kind of along the same lines that we're talking about here is within our community, our faith community, All Saints Online and St. Andrews, one of the foundational aspects of our community is inclusion. That is something that we talk about consistently. I would say that we show it very well. Like I said at the beginning, all means all. So with inclusion being a foundational part of our community, how do you define that word, inclusion?
That's a great question. Well, I'm going to go back to what I was just talking about, this sort of image of God business and God's creation business. Inclusion really is about being willing to see the diversity that exists in the world and recognize the presence of God in it. And so that means not only recognizing the presence of God in the people who are there, but also recognizing when you're missing something, right? So if we have a community that in person right now is probably, is certainly predominantly white folks, right? But if we believe that the diversity of God, the creation of God is everybody, and it includes people of color, then if we don't find a way to make sure when people of color are in space, they feel welcome, we're inhibiting the community's ability to reflect the image of God, right? So inclusion is really important, and that includes, diversity of race and ethnicity and people with different political perspectives even, right? Which I'll say more about in a second. But ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, just this idea. Again, if we believe God created all these folks, which again, I do, mm-hmm. Then if we want to understand the image of God, we have to welcome everyone and work to make sure everyone is present. And that's why we talk about inclusion, so people know that they're welcome. You don't want anyone to walk in and wonder, is this a safe space for me? It's not going to work. They're not going to come back. They're not going to know that unless you say it out loud. But even when I talk about political difference, and I will even talk about theological difference as well, I like to talk about being theologically expansive. So there are some fundamental things we believe as Christians in Jesus and the resurrection and how Jesus was divine and those kinds of things. But if you ask people in the pews to sort of explain what their personal understandings of those things are, you're going to get as many different answers as you have people in the pews. And I don't think that's a problem. And I think it's a good thing. Because I even know, I think about me and Pastor John. We have very similar theology, but it's not exactly the same. And I think that I'm a better Christian and a better pastor when I engage with people whose theology is not the same as mine. And I let myself be influenced by these other human beings who are also have their understanding of God that they've learned through their thinking and through their experiences of God. I believe in Julian's experience of God, Chris, I believe you have had experience of God that you can tell me about. And I can understand who God is with us and for us better because we've talked about that. And if you're telling me what you know of God is exactly the same as what I know, that's great. And that makes me feel like seen. But also, I don't know that it teaches me anything more about God. And so I welcome diversity of theological sort of ideas and certainly experience. Like, I want to know how God has been operating in people's lives. And I love to hear those stories and learn from different folks. And again, people from different communities talk about that in different ways. They experience it in different ways. Men and women maybe talk about that in different ways. People who are part of the LGBTQ community might talk about that in different ways. And we're just, if what we're trying to do is learn something about God, and we believe in God's creation and God's identity being manifest in all people, specifically, if we talk about that, then we have to know people. We can't just know someone who looks like me and think I know God. God does not look like Chris Jorgensen, but that doesn't mean that there's something of God in me, just like there is in every other person whose experiences and social location might be radically different than mine.
That's preachable, and I know it because I've heard you preach it and continue to preach it, but I also couldn't echo that any better or more than I do. Well, we're going to kind of wrap up our conversation. We will definitely have you back probably many times.
I have a lot to say, so that's good.
I love it. I love it so much good stuff here. But the final thing that I want to ask you is if you could broadcast just one message to every smartphone, iPad, every device worldwide is going to see it, but you only have 10 seconds, what would that message be that you would want to broadcast?
Gosh, I think it would have to be you, just as you are created in the image of God, and you are loved. So go forth to live in the truth of who you are and see what God is going to do through you when you do that.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you again so much for being here. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Yeah, this is great. I look forward to being here again.